Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we will be making this dress. It's a wrap style dress and I'm using a Vogue pattern to make it. I've made it once before and it's actually pretty easy to make. It just takes a little bit of time to make. Anyway, let's get into making the dress. I began cutting all the pieces out, starting with the bodice back, the bodice front, then the sleeves, and also all the other pieces off camera. Iron the interfacing pieces onto the back facing and onto the two front facings. Align the circle marks for the pleats, then pin and stitch the pleats in place using a basting stitch. Fold each tie and pin the folded tie in place. Then sew a 1 cm seam allowance along the edge and finish the stitch at the end so that the end with the circles can be flipped right sides out. Turn the ties right sides out. I turn these out in two different ways. This took about 5 minutes of fiddling to turn this right sides out. On the second tie, I started from the closed end and towards the open end. This was much quicker. I then carefully ironed the ties flat and basted the open edge closed. Pin the tie to each bodice front pieces, matching the circles to the circles. Pin the tie so it is going downwards from the bodice. E-stitch the shoulder edges of the bodice back. Pin the back and front bodice pieces together at the shoulder and side seams, with matching the notches and symbols. Adjust the shoulder ease as needed. Stitch a double stitch along each seam. I did 1 cm and 1.5 cm seam allowance. Then press all of the seams towards the back of the bodice. Stitch the left side of the bodice with a double stitch along the entire seam, then press. For the right side of the bodice, stitch the front and back together, however leaving an opening between the circle symbols. Do a second stitch along the long edge above the gap. Press all seam allowances and trim allowances on all edges except the small edge under the tie opening. Then trim loose threads and remove basting stitches on the shoulder seams. Sew a stay stitch on the neck edge between the two big circles. For steps 11, 12 and 13 we will be skipping these and going straight to step 14. Stitch the front and back facings together, matching notches and symbols. Pin the facing to the bodice. I started with matching the seams, notches and symbols and pinning it in place. Then I pinned the edges down with extra pins. I stitched these pieces right sides together and trimmed seam allowances and clipped the curves. Sew an understitch along the facing. This gives the garment a nice finish along the neck edge. I then unpicked the stay stitch from the neck edge. While sewing, I frequently paused to check the seam hadn't moved to being folded underneath the sewing needle. Turn the facing inside out and stitch the facing to the shoulder seams. Press the facing while it's facing to the inside of the bodice. I also press the bodice on the right side of the fabric too. For step 18, we will be skipping this step. Fold along the fold line with wrong sides together. Iron the fold and I kept the pins in place. Baste the upper edges together. I basted at a 1 cm seam allowance so it would not be seamed once the skirt and bodice is sewn together. Stitch the skirt back with right sides together in a double stitch. I didn't have a twin needle at the time, so I stitched the seam at 1.5 cm and 1 cm to achieve a double stitch look. Also, double stitch the back skirt pieces to the front skirt pieces and with all notches matching. Iron the seam allowance to the back and trim the seam allowance. Before I started pinning the bodice to the skirt, I first found the centre back of the skirt. I did this by matching the two seams together, then making a fold on the back of the fabric. The crease in the back indicates the centre back. I used a heat erasable pen to mark the centre back. The next step is to then sew the bodice to the skirt. Unfold the bodice facing, pin the waist edge of the skirt to the waist edge of the bodice, matching the notches, seams and centre back, with the bodice facing crease matching the folded skirt crease. Baste this in place using a longer stitch. After basting, turn the edge of the facing fold over the skirt facing edge so that the bodice facing is sandwiching the skirt. Stitch the entire waist at 1.5 cm, then stitch again about 6 mm away from the first stitch. Once both stitches are done, trim the excess seam allowance close to the stitches Then press the seams upwards towards the bodice. It was then time to flip the bodice facing to the inside of the dress and tack the facing at the seams. Do 2 ease stitches between the 2 circles. I did a 3.5mm stitch length and sewed at 1 cm and 2 cm. This way the actual seam that attaches the sleeve to the bodice goes between the 2 ease stitches. Stitch the sleeve underarm edges in a double stitch seam with notches matching together. Trim the seam allowance and iron towards the back. For the sleeve hem, I folded a 3.2 cm hem. I used pins with glass heads to secure the fold and pressed with the iron. The instructions mentioned to baste the fold, but I felt I didn't really need to do this, so I left the pins in and hand sewed the hem in place. Steps 28, 29, 30 and 31 were all skipped because this is for the bee dress. Now, when it comes to attaching the sleeve to the dress, start by pinning the sleeve to the armhole with the sleeve on the inside and right sides together. Match all the circles, notches and seams together and adjust the ease as needed. After I was happy with the amount of gathering, I thoroughly pinned in place and hand sewed a base stitch. I sewed at a 1.5 cm seam allowance and sewed a second seam at a 1 cm seam allowance. I trimmed the seam allowance, ironed the seam allowance towards the sleeve, then turned it all right sides out. Moving on to the hem of the dress, turn the lower edge of the self facings to the outside of the dress along the fold lines at 5 cm. Stitch at 3.2 cm above the lower edge and trim the fabric near the corner to remove the bulk. Turn the self facings to the inside, turning at a 3.2 cm hem for the rest of the lower edge. Iron the fold flat. Before we get to sewing the hem in place, sew a few ease stitches at 6 mm along the raw edge and 1 ease stitch for each skirt pieces. This makes it easier to adjust when hand sewing. I used the same hand stitch as I did for the sleeves and hand sewed the hem in place and did a final press with the iron. And lastly, I hand sewed the inner edge of the self facings in place. The instructions didn't include this, however I also hand sewed the entire facing in place too. This included the facing pieces on the bodice. Doing this entire bodice and skirt hem facing actually took a very long time. It took about 10 hours to completely finish the invisible hem and the invisible stitches on the facing. I used my tailor's ham to assist in propping up the facing whilst I was hand sewing. The entire hem and facing is now finished. I then trimmed the loose ease stitch ends. I also added a hook and eye closure above the bust as a modesty closure. So for reference, I used a previous dress I made to mark the placements of the hook and eye closures, which ended up being 23 cm above the bodice skirt seam measured at the facing. I sewed the hook on the left side of the bodice and sewed the eye on the right side of the bodice. I hand sewed extra stitches as I found the original stitches for the hook and eye closures were not secure enough. The dress is now finished. Let's have a look. The dress is finally finished. I finally stopped delaying the hand sewing and I stopped procrastinating. I actually did it, it's all done. Anyway, I'm really happy with how this dress turned out. It is a little bit tight on the arms because it is winter and it's a summer dress, so hopefully it'll fit in the summer. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm pretty happy having a different colour dress. I do have it the same style in yellow, so it's nice to have the same style but in a different colour. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something from it. Thank you so much and bye for now.